All right, so if you don't want your face to be on here, go ahead and hide yourself. I am recording. And now I'm going to go back to sharing. Thank you. So yeah, you want to go ahead and prepare your training content in advance based off of the recording and the slides that I give you. And I would also suggest, take us up on these one-on-one consulting sessions that we're offering. You can have 30 minutes to an hour directly with me to walk you through this, to help you put together training materials. And that's every Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. Prepare for people to ask you questions about professional translation. Remember that the information I'm giving you today is not sufficient for full interpreter professional training, and some of the volunteers you have might have questions about how they can get professional training. So maybe look into compiling some resources in your area that you can share with them. And finally, I recommend gathering feedback afterward to identify areas where you can improve. And you can kind of turn this into a training for bilingual helpers that will help your organization and your city and your region have a training program for future volunteers that can be used over and over again, even when the crisis situation ends, just as a best practice for working with bilingual helpers and volunteers. This workshop is going to teach you what you need to know to be able to teach others. It's not a curriculum for you to directly present to others. And this is for two main reasons. One is that you're going to be more effective if you learn this information directly and absorb it. And two, audiences, needs, and resources vary quite a bit. And a curriculum that works for one person might not apply to the needs of others. So with that being said, please take some time during or after this presentation to jot down ideas you're having about this content, potential activities, resources that you can pull together to present this information to your audience in the ways best suited to their needs. Finally, please note that training you provide, like I said, cannot be considered professional translator interpreter training. It takes years of study, training, and practice to become a professional translator interpreter. And this workshop is designed to help you help people who do have language skills to help the communities they serve, particularly in emergency situations. So combining language skills with a number of basic principles will make your project or whatever it is that you need to translate or convey more accurate, complete, ethical, and safe, and will have a better result for everybody involved. So getting to know some of the basic getting to know the basic principles of translation will help you to answer these questions and to think about every project or interaction more critically and from a more informed perspective. So in other words, before you can train people, you have to understand yourselves. And I know that we have a broad spectrum of experience within Welcoming America's membership in terms of how many of you might know some of this information already and how many of you are starting from scratch. So I've tried to present a range of, from the very basics to the more advanced in this presentation. And again, if you're having trouble with any of these themes, or if you're a newcomer to the world of language access, please do feel free to take me up on those one-on-one counseling sessions so that I can kind of walk you through things. So I'm going to start at the very, 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 very beginning here, because I think it's really important to just, put it out there that translation and interpretation are not the same thing. Like I said before, I think it's really easy to assume that because somebody is bilingual, that they're able to translate or that they're able to interpret. And the reality is that translation and interpretation are totally separate disciplines. They require different skill sets, they require different training, and being bilingual doesn't make you a good translator or a good interpreter. And being a good translator doesn't mean that you're a good interpreter. Being a good interpreter doesn't make you a good translator, right? So I think it's really important for you guys to know, but also for you to remind your volunteers that these skills take time and effort to craft. And you don't have that time during an emergency, but we can at least talk about the main differences and lay down some best practices that can help inexperienced translators do a good job. So basically, interpretation is oral and translation is written. With interpretation, you really have to have a high level of fluency in both of your languages because it's real time or near real time. And you have to sort of understand how to convey tone and inflection and register and correct body positioning. And these are all things we're going to talk about later today when we talk about how to train your interpreters. But in the meantime, just be thinking from the perspective that you have to be really, good and on the ball to be an interpreter. And to do language translation, you do need to be obviously fluent, especially in the target language. And I'm going to define target language for you in a little bit, but basically it's the language that you're translating into. But you can use resources to supplement some of that on-the-spot fluency. So in other words, you can use dictionaries and glossaries and online forums and research to get a really good translation as opposed to just kind of like being on the fly. And I also think it's really important to tell you guys that it is best practice to only use native speakers of the target language or the language that content is being translated into. And that's because no matter how long you've been speaking a language, how well studied you are in your language pairs, how many years you've lived abroad, you're never going to have the full fluency and understanding of a language needed to be an effective translator. And to give you an example, I've been a professional translator for almost 15 years, and I lived abroad for 6 of those years, and I don't feel comfortable translating into Spanish. I mean, I can, but it's not best practice, and there's always that little bit of doubt in the back of my mind whenever I'm translating into Spanish. And so, especially with people who aren't as experienced, you really want to stay away from even heritage speakers, to be honest. And a heritage speaker is somebody who grew up in the United States with bilingual parents, who grew up immersed in the language, learning the language, but doesn't have formal written skills or formal writing skills. So you want to be careful that you're just using native speakers. And there's some flexibility there depending on, what content you're translating. But we're going to learn about when that's appropriate and when that's not appropriate. So staying at the beginning here, it's important to ask, what is translation? When we talk about the principles of translating, think of it as an action that is transforming a start text, which is called a source text, into a target text. And what this means is that the process should take the meaning, right, not just the words of the source text, and carry it over through translation to the target text. And target text needs to be appropriate to the consumer's language and the consumer's culture. Right? So translation is a process, meaning that it's okay to change the actual expressions in the words as long as the key information from the source text carries over to the target text. The purpose of this source text is to, convey the meaning and not the words. And I think that's one of the big things that untrained bilingual helpers will need help with from you is this explanation that they're not trying to translate word for word or find the verbatim, kind of definition of words, but rather the meaning and the key concepts. And this is something that I think untrained translators struggle with a lot, right? Because they don't know what they don't know. And so, it's up to us to tell them, like, this is about meaning. It's not about being rigid and verbatim and doing word for word. It's also important to tell your bilingual helpers to remember that the consumer or the person who is reading the translations, the English learner on the other end, doesn't have access to the source text, right? The source text being the original file that will be translated. And obviously, intellectually we know that, but when you really think about what that means, it is that the translator has a lot of power here, since his or her actions will render that information that's received by the consumers entirely, and they will have no frame of reference for what the source content was. So for this reason, it's best to involve more than one person in the translation if bilingual helpers are being used instead of trained professionals, right? So you want to have volunteer translators as well as volunteer proofreaders. And the proofreaders don't necessarily have to have the same degree of training but they do have to have the language skills and be native speakers of the language to be able to catch errors and things like that. So the process of translation is another one of these basic principles of translation that you want to convey to bilingual helpers. And that basically means that, and this is all defined, by the way, by the International Crisis Translation Network. They've suggested a specific process for bilingual helper translations, specifically in crisis situations, right? So usually this translation process would be a lot more involved, and there would be more steps, and there would be tools being used. But for the purposes of just getting things done quickly and accurately, they're just dividing the translation process into 3 phases, which are basically just before, during, and after. And in the before portion, it's really important that you tell the translator to read the source text very carefully. And again, this is something that would seem really obvious intellectually, but even professional translators sometimes, I mean, you know, not good professional translators, but freelancers and translators who consider themselves to be professionals will sometimes just start translating without reading the text, right? Especially because sometimes they're translating, you know, 150-page product manuals, and who wants to read that? But you have to read everything you're going to translate from start to finish. Because while you're reading it, the translator can kind of take notes of sections of the translation that are difficult or might need extra time or resources to work with. So I recommend asking your bilingual helpers to read the source text and highlight any challenging parts that they think they're going to have to spend extra time on, so that they can sort of start thinking of good solutions before they even start the translation process. And then during the translation, once everything has been thoroughly read and potential challenges, new vocabulary, and content have been identified, translation can begin. And the biggest thing you'll need to stress to your bilingual helpers during this phase is that everything needs to be translated. Now, this doesn't mean that every word or every exact expression needs to be translated, but it does mean that all of the main information and key ideas need to be translated, and that the translator is free to change expressions or idioms or wording to make that happen. So for example, something like raining cats and dogs, right? It really wouldn't make sense to translate that literally into most languages. So the translator can feel free in that case to just translate this into raining very hard, right? Or something like that, as long as no meaningful information is lost in the process. And then during the after phase, this is where you have to make sure that your bilingual helpers are revising their own work, as well as, if possible, having a third party jump in to also do an additional revision. And that's basically just to screen for errors and ensure that the translation is accurate, complete, and meaningful, which, you know, that's like the power trio for translation: accurate, complete, meaningful. And that means nothing is omitted, nothing is added. There's no, you know, decision that's been made by the translator that significantly affects the final product. Another important sort of principle of translation to talk to your volunteer translators about is effective writing, right? When people become involved in a volunteer translation project, they need to have the language skills necessary to be able to really understand the source text. However, the target text is what's most important, right? So tell your volunteers that instead of asking themselves, how can I understand this, or agonizing over, you know, really interpreting the meaning of every phrase in the source text, that they should really focus more on asking themselves, how can I translate this into my language, or how would this work in my culture? So that's not to say that they don't have to be able to understand the source text, just that less time should be spent agonizing over the source text and more time should be focused on meaning in the target language. Remember that in the translation process, there are sort of 2 processes happening in the brain: understanding language and producing languages. So you can't help a volunteer translator write effectively in either language, but you can give them questions to ask themselves, right? Such as, what makes this an effective text in your language, in your culture? Or ask yourself who, what, when, where, and why every time there's a new text. Who's the audience? You know, why? What's the purpose of this translation? What type of text is it that I have to translate, right? Is it Western alphabet? Is it something that's written left to right? What are the features of this text? How is it going to work in my language? What does it look and sound like, right? Are there long sentences, short sentences, repetitions, right? Have them really start asking questions about what the final project is going to look like so that they can focus on product while they're also thinking about meaning. So the concept of general and specialized writing is also really important when you're talking about, you know, teaching people how to translate, because general words, you know, can be used as general speech, but also by specialists to have a completely different meaning. And it's really important to think about how these words can be used in lots of different areas and ways. So remembering that there is general language, which is like everyday use, and specialist language used by specialists to talk about specific kinds of knowledge. And it's very, very important for a bilingual helper to spend lots of time identifying and translating specialized texts. So this is because it's really easy for a non-professional to be sort of tricked by words or a group of words that look easy to understand, but that's only if they're being used to discuss everyday matters in their general use. And the problem arises when general language words are actually being used in a special way to talk about some special area of knowledge. In this case, you have to be careful that your bilingual helper really understands the words in the specific context of a given project, right? So, you know, I see this all the time with when we're screening translators for employment at my organization, translating something like an IEP for a school, which is an individualized education plan. There's a lot of general language about education and pedagogy in these documents, but, you know, translators who aren't very experienced will just translate them in their everyday meaning, but really in the specific field of, you know, early childhood education or in the PSSAs, they have specific meanings, right? Like a service plan is a specific legal document, right? And not just generally a plan for service. So whenever, I would say this is probably the #1 thing that can trip up non-professional translators. So in the specific, more research and more time is going to be needed in cases where you have this kind of general terminology that's used in a specialized context. And another example is just that a word can have a different meaning depending on when it's being used to talk about medicine or building a house or preparing for a disaster, right? So training your volunteers to think about this specialized use of language in the specific case of your needs is really important when you're preparing your bilingual helpers. These areas of use are called domains within the field, and the lay point for a bilingual helper is not to really understand the word itself, but to understand the domain and then to understand the ideas behind the word in that domain, right? And the final sort of point I want to make about general translation knowledge is revision, right? Revision is an absolutely essential piece of this puzzle, and it's something that, you know, seems obvious, but you want to talk to your bilingual helpers about technique because it's a super duper essential step in any translation process. So remind your bilingual helpers that it's always a good idea to try to put away a text for a while and then come back to it with fresh eyes, maybe the next morning, whenever you're producing translated text. I know I always can, you know, go back and see things with fresh new eyes and find errors if I like take a breather even just for an hour or two. And then it's also a good idea to have a second or a third pair of eyes check the work and give feedback. And we talked in last week's lesson about like a spectrum of consequences. So when it comes to language access, you know, maybe sending a reminder home in a kid's backpack that show and tell is tomorrow has less humanly devastating consequences than translating epilepsy medication for an infant, right? And it's not our choice to choose, you know, what information is important and what information is not important. But I think that you can make a decision of how much resource you want to put into proofreading or post-editing or revising a document, editing a document afterward, right? So in general, the rules in the before, during, after workflow would be that a volunteer reviewer would check the translated text once it's been produced by the bilingual helper. This is called bilingual review within the fields for obvious reasons, but because the reviewer will look at the start text and the translated text and compare them. In general, the more revision you do, the higher the quality of your document is going to be. Even the most professional translators would benefit from 2, 3, 4 revisions. Obviously, that's a little bit much for most basic communication, but you know, more revision equals higher quality, and more people revising equals better revision. So keep that in mind, and that, you know, revision doesn't mean translating the text all over again, right? It doesn't take as long, it shouldn't take as long, but rather it's about making sure that the translated text will work effectively for the final reader. If that makes sense. So before we move on to talk about interpreter best practices and interpreter ethics, I want to just say that if the goal of your project is to have a final translated text that is of like the highest standards, you want to make sure that you go with a professional translator, and that would be backed up by like a high level of quality assurance, and that should be your first consideration. But if employing the services of a professional translator is not possible, or if the goal of your bilingual helper project is not only about the production of like a final translated text, you still need to consider the level of translation quality that is possible and appropriate to achieve for your specific project, and the ways in which that quality can be achieved, right? A lot of which we just talked about. And I have some general guiding principles that you can follow regarding translation quality, whatever the language. And the first one is in an emergency situation. We talked about this a little bit during the first workshop, but not all texts might require the same level of quality in these situations. So think about the purpose of the translations. For example, if the purpose of the translation is to just get an overall basic understanding of some information that's not going to be read by many people, or not including anything life-altering or anything with health and safety or any vital information, then it's possible to and appropriate to kind of achieve your project in the ways that you can put the minimum number of resources at. But if the translation contains like really important information, detailed information that many readers are going to need to use carefully, then you want to use a higher level of quality, right? The higher level of quality desired, the more drafts of the translated text you should make. A translation will usually improve with each draft. Putting the text away in between drafts and coming back to it again with fresh eyes is helpful. I did mention that before, but I think especially for volunteers, that can be a really powerful way for them to feel confident in their own work. Having more than one person look at the translated text and give their opinion can also really help improve the quality of a translation. And finally, you can think about quality in several ways, right? You can think about more than just the quality of spelling, grammar, and so on. I suggest focusing more on accuracy, completeness, and form at the very least, especially in an emergency. I personally believe, and I think that there's no standard established for this, right? We've never been in a situation like this before in a world. And so there is no playbook to say what you can and cannot do during an emergency. But my personal belief is that little grammatical errors, spelling errors, punctuation errors, word choice that's maybe not like the best word, but that still conveys the meaning, I think that stuff is fine during an emergency situation. You really just want to focus more about the accuracy, completeness, and that core information and meaning is preserved. So in other words, when you think about the quality of a translated text, just think about how accurately the translated text carries over all of the main information and key ideas of the start text in a form that is appropriate to the target language and culture. So this is all a mouthful, and it's just impossible to squeeze everything there is to teach volunteer interpreter and translators into a 1-hour workshop, right? And so this one is like a fire hose of information coming at you. And again, you know, call me, email me, reach out, schedule a session with me, and we can talk about how this information relates to you all personally. So now we're going to kind of pivot and talk about the basic interpreter ethics and best practices that you want to be teaching any bilingual helpers who are out there in the field interpreting for you, doing phone interpretation, video interpretation, field interpretation, you know, any interpretation at all needs to be done at the very minimum using an ethical code and some best practice techniques that you can easily teach bilingual helpers in like one mini session. You can go as deep into this training as you want, right? There are 40-hour trainings that are basically standard for any interpreter who wants to work in the field. Obviously, you know, in situations like this, you're not going to put that level of resource into a volunteer, but you do want to make sure that they're doing things safely and ethically when they're out there in the field, both to protect yourselves and also to make sure that the consumer is, you know, receiving the important information that they need, right? And getting equitable access to health and safety information. So we're going to watch a video. It's a little bit of a silly video, but I think it does a good job of showing what can happen when like family members are used as interpreters, or, you know, if a lot of the times you'll have people that say, oh, my cousin came with me, I just want him to interpret, or they won't want an interpreter for a number of different reasons. And so this video is just like one example of why that is bad news. And I want you all to watch it, and then after watching it, just briefly unmute yourselves and tell me what you think some of the things that are wrong with this situation are, right? So, you know, what about this video makes you uncomfortable? What do you think the interpreter is doing wrong? What do you think is something that you've seen before that worries you, right? Hey, can everybody hear video? Huh. Check and make sure that your volume's all the way up. I mean, probably since everybody's having the same problem, it is not.
Hi, this is Emily Yaffe. When you share screen, there's an option for optimizing it, and I think this can affect the sound sometimes. So if you don't click on that box to optimize, it might not be working.
Natasha.
Hi. Здравствуйте.
Hello.
Nice to see you again.
Another. Hi, I'm Bryony. I'm the health visitor. I'm here to see Natasha.
I'm Alexei. There was some problem with the interpreter.
Yes, the dates got mixed up at the interpreting agency because an appointment was moved. Thanks for doing this at such short notice.
That's okay. I have a business in the city. I can afford to close it for an hour. Well, come in. I will take your coat.
How are mum and the baby?
Yeah, they're good. Baby's sleeping now. He snores like his father.
Your brother?
My brother, Victor.
And mum?
She never leaves the house. Natasha?
Hi. Здравствуйте.
Hello.
Nice to see you again.
Она рада тебя видеть вновь.
How are you?
Как поживаешь?
Хорошо, спасибо.
Good, thank you.
And how is your baby?
Как ребенок?
С ним все хорошо, но он очень плохо спит.
He is well, but he doesn't sleep a lot.
Shall we sit down?
Ты предложила присесть?
Да, конечно, простите, пожалуйста.
Yeah, of course, sorry.
So are you making sure you get enough time to rest?
Спрашивает, есть ли у тебя время, чтобы отдохнуть?
Я пытаюсь, но с ребенком так много работы. Так устала, что ничего не хочу делать.
Well, she tried, but there's so much work with the baby, and she tired and don't feel like doing it.
Если бы я была с мамой и сестрами, они бы мне помогали, а тут я совсем одна.
If she will be at home with mother and sisters, they help her with the baby, but here is just herself, and it's hard for her.
Are you worrying about things a lot?
Не слишком ли много ты вещей на себя берешь? Не нервничаешь ли?
Я чувствую себя сильно одинокой, ведь я все делаю сама.
Well, sometimes she feels alone, and that she's doing all these things by herself.
Ладно, не говори, прости.
Yeah, she shouldn't say that. Что ты такое говоришь? Я специально с работы ушел, чтобы тебе здесь помочь. У тебя Виктор есть, всегда можешь к нему обратиться. I'm just telling her that she has Victor and I'm here, and she needs to ask if she wants more help.
Does Victor help out with the baby?
Oh, he's very good. He's a good father. When he gets back from work until he goes to bed, he's always taking care of baby. He's a wonderful, wonderful father.
That's good. Can you ask Natasha?
Тебе Виктор помогает?
Да, он очень хорошо ладит с ребенком.
Oh yes, he is a very good father.
Просто он всегда занят на работе. Я никогда не могу ничего у него попросить. Я очень одинока.
But sometimes he is very busy at work and she don't feel she can ask much of him. Что ты хочешь еще от Виктора? Он постоянно работает, чтобы вас тут прокормить. Неблагодарная. I was telling her that my brother, he works day and night to feed them. She's ungrateful.
Right, okay. Look, I came to weigh the baby and he's sleeping. There's some leaflets I want to bring. Can you tell Natasha this, please? There's some leaflets I want to bring you.
Она здесь брошюрки принесла.
So I'm going to come back tomorrow. Are you free tomorrow at 2?
Здесь она брошюрки принесла. В общем, завтра собирается в 2 часа вернуться. Здесь будешь? I'm working tomorrow afternoon. I cannot come.
That's okay. I'm going to book an interpreter.
Она собирается переводчика привезти. Why? I can do it. She's my family.
No, I prefer to have an interpreter here. It's better for me. Okay, now I've got to get to another appointment, but I'll be back tomorrow at 2.
Завтра в 2 часа вернется.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
So, is everybody able to hop on and just really briefly talk about what you saw in that video and what was wrong with it? Oh boy, I'm having problems with unmuting again, so I'm just going to go through and manually unmute everybody.
Prior to this pandemic,
Oops. All right, I'm just kind of unmuting everybody manually.
Hi, Mary Jane. This is Sabine calling from Louisville.
Hi there.
Thanks for sharing that video. So just off the bat, I think family always has good intentions, that they may be a good go-to, an easy go-to, but, there are some biases involved, and, it may be better to just have an unbiased approach, that someone is just translating exactly what's being said when there's a question being asked, because he was clearly favoring the brother.
Yeah, I think bias is a really good one. And I'm seeing down here in the comment sections, the relationship with a family member affects the ability of the person to actually communicate what they feel, right? So not only does the interpreter have a bias, but the subject doesn't feel comfortable sharing personal information in front of this person. There were a whole lot of other things going on there, like side conversations, and I think this is a really good video for you all to share with any kind of volunteer interpreters you have, so that they can kind of see some of these pitfalls. And we're going to talk about them, first from a practical skills perspective, and then from an ethical perspective. And again, this is information that you can directly convey to your volunteers to make them more effective and to make their interpretation just more, oh, I see a question here. Yes, I will absolutely share that video with everybody. Just to make sure that their communication is, when we talk about ethical and safe and effective, this is one of the reasons, right? And there are a lot of reasons, and there are a lot of things that interpreters do and can do to either make the process not so great or to make the process great. And the one thing that I always tell interpreters when I'm training them is, it's not the interpreter's job to speak on behalf of the English learner. It's the interpreter's job to make sure that the English learner can use his or her own voice, right? It's about equity. It's about justice. It's not about saving them or inserting your own opinion or, crossing boundaries because you have opinions about what's going on. It's just about being professional, preserving those boundaries, doing it correctly and accurately. And I think most people who are volunteering in this capacity are doing it because they want to help people. And it's really important to let your volunteers know that the best way they can help people in this context is to be a good interpreter and to follow the rules, right? We're not advocates. We're not acting in this capacity as liaisons, right? We are there to give somebody their own voice and equitable access, and that's it, right? So many of the problems that are associated with untrained interpreters are actually that they're trying to be too helpful, right? And they're not following the best practices, or in a lot of cases, they don't know the best practices. So best practices are as follows. A very, very brief version. I do want to be mindful of your time. There's probably more than I can fit into this hour. I am happy to either stay on later until it's done or carry some of this information in the next one. So if you guys can drop your opinion about that in the comments, whether you'd like me to stay late today and just get it done or roll the ethical portion into next week's presentation, I'm happy to do either. So the first common interpreter mistake is body positioning. And body positioning is super important for a lot of reasons. Imagine the example that you are, a woman from a culture for whom family planning is taboo, and you are at an OB-GYN appointment to talk about potentially getting birth control or tubal ligation or something that's really taboo in your community. And the interpreter comes in and stands between you and the doctor and talks to the doctor about you rather than talking to you, right? That's going to make you feel really isolated. You're not going to know what's going on. You're not going to be comfortable. And what ends up happening in those situations is that it devolves into the interpreter and the doctor talking to each other about the patient rather than the patient actively participating in his or her own care. And so you want to tell your volunteer interpreters that whenever possible, they should sit off to the side and slightly behind the target language speaker, This really serves to emphasize the message and not the interpreter. It reduces distractions and it increases the engagement between the subject and the speaker, right? So one example I always give is if you've ever seen what the UN General Assembly room looks like, it's just like rows and rows of diplomats with microphones and earpieces. And then the entire perimeter of the room has gray booths around it. And interpreters sit in those booths and there's a microphone and there's simultaneous interpretation while, sessions are happening, right? So as an in-person interpreter, you want to put an invisible booth around yourself, right? To isolate yourself from the speaker and the subject and to increase the engagement between the two of them. And one of the big ways you can do that is through body position. Because if you step off to the side and you put your head down and you're not making eye contact, then you're not like stealing the thunder, right? You're not in the middle of the show. It's not the interpreter show, right? That's what I say a lot of the time. Another one is a failure to speak in the first person. Oops. This is the standard for professional interpretation, right? So you're not going to say, if you're that doctor, ask the patient what she thinks about X, right? You're going to say, or when you're the interpreter, you're not going to say, the doctor said he wants me to ask you what you think about X, right? You're just going to interpret straight, what do you think about X? And then the response is going to be, I think X is great. You're not going to say to the doctor, she said she thinks X is great. You're just going to interpret X is great, right? This allows for a more accurate message. It reduces confusion. And a thing called third-party confusion also happens, which is where languages that have lots of pronouns tend to get confused. If you're saying something like, she sells seashells by the seashore, and you're not, in the first person saying, I sell seashells, somebody might be like, well, who's selling the seashells? Is it that person or is she selling them? Right? And so speaking in the first person always makes it clear. And it also, gives the person directly their voice because they're just speaking through you. And so that's another way to kind of build this interpreter box around your interpreters, and a really easy way that you can help your volunteers be more effective, right? Body positioning, first person speech. Already, just with those two steps, they're going to be, orders of magnitude more effective, just with these two little things. Another big one is that most untrained interpreters don't understand how to manage their interpretation sessions or to clarify information. So by clarification, we mean sometimes no matter how fluent you are or how good you are, sessions won't go smoothly. So you might have difficult accents, unknown slang, individuals who mumble or speak too quickly. You never want to engage in a clarifying conversation that excludes the other party, right? What you want to do is you want to tell your volunteer interpreters that if they're in a session and they don't understand a word, or they need to clarify meaning, or if somebody was speaking too quickly or with a bad accent, or not bad accent, but with a difficult to understand accent, the best thing to do is to interrupt the session and say, excuse me, as an interpreter, I need to clarify. Can you please explain the meaning of this? And then once the meaning has been clarified, you're going to tell the other party, I was just asking for clarification. And that way everybody knows what's going on and you're not excluding anybody from the conversation. Doing this appropriately creates less disruption. Even though it is inherently disruptive, it creates a better flow because everybody understands what's happening and you're making sure that you're accurately conveying what's being said. And making sure that you're including everybody, makes sure that nobody's feeling excluded, because as soon as you start having side conversations with either the subject or the speaker, it's really hard to regain that trust, right? And so just always making sure that everybody is involved is another one of these big important things that you can tell your volunteers to do to be more effective. Managing the session is another big thing that I think really affects volunteer interpreters. And what happens is that sometimes people will talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and not pause to give the interpreter time to interpret, right? And a professional interpreter knows when to interject, but I think that a lot of the times volunteer interpreters don't want to make waves, or they don't want to be rude, and they will end up paraphrasing as a result. I usually talk about this when I train interpreters in terms of, I say that, you know, imagine that your memory is a bucket, right? It's called your memory bucket. And it doesn't matter how many PhDs you have, how many languages you speak, how experienced you are, there's only so much physical space in that memory bucket for information. So the more somebody talks, the more full that memory bucket gets, and the more likely it is that the interpreter will make mistakes, right? Note-taking is helpful for this, but being able to interject and tell everybody, hey, slow down, I need to interpret, is called managing the session within the field. And it actually creates better flow. It reduces summarizations, which is really important. And it kind of helps set the precedent for the rest of the session, right? It feels really awkward the first time you interrupt somebody and just start interpreting over them, but it's a skill that can be developed with practice, and it's a really important skill to have just to make sure that you're getting it right, because it's really easy to lose track and forget if you're not a professional after somebody says maybe even 1 or 2 sentences, right? So make sure you tell your volunteers, if you are using correct body positioning, you're off to the side, you're slightly behind, you know, usually the subject, and you kind of put your body in the middle, it's really an effective way of managing the session and breaking things up without being rude, right? Because you're going from being withdrawn and kind of trying to reduce your presence to putting your head up and loudly asserting, using your hands if you need to, and just kind of hopping in there and saying, I need to start interpreting now. Or, you know, when you get really good at it, you just start interpreting. And eventually the speakers are going to catch on. So finally, I think I am going to wrap up today and then carry the ethics into the next session, because this stuff is all really important to share with anybody who's volunteering. And again, I know it's a lot of information, but really, you know, all of your operations with English learners are going to be so much more safe if they're done in this way. And I believe that even just these basic steps can make any bilingual helper, you know, like I said, a million bazillion times more effective. So the final kind of practical tip I have for you to convey to your bilingual helpers today is tone, register, and style. And this is where words are only part of what is being said. Professional interpreters will replicate the register, style, and tone of the speaker. And this will prevent confusion, ensure an accurate message, and most importantly, instill confidence in both parties that what they're saying is actually being conveyed, right? And this is huge because trust is so important when you're the interpreter. It's such a huge responsibility, and people really are looking to you to be their voice. And so taking this responsibility seriously in a way that, you know, is attempting to align with the best practices of the profession is something that I'd like to see all volunteers doing. And I think a simple training that rolls in what we're talking about today and what we'll talk about next week is one of the best ways to do that. So I got ahead of myself because I just had so much information that I wanted to share with everybody. So I know a lot of you have to go, but I'm going to continue recording, and I'm happy to stay as late as anyone wants me to answer questions, because we didn't get to do a Q&A today because I had so much information. And then next week we'll continue with the ethics of professional interpretation. So if you guys want to go ahead and ask any questions that you have, I am here to do Q&A as long as you would like me to. I also have 2 slots open this week, this Thursday from 3 to 3:30, and also from 3:30 to 4 for one-on-one consulting sessions if anybody has like in-depth questions that they would like some guidance with.
And just so that everyone is aware, even if you have to drop off now at 4, we are recording all of these sessions and they are being shared in the member library through the member forum, so you can access the full session. And so if you drop off, we'll still be posting that, and that should be posted hopefully later on today or tomorrow. And I am going to drop off, so thank you.
All right, thanks, Melissa. All right, does anybody have questions?
Hi, this is Eva from Louisville.
Hi there.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you have any advice. I'm a Spanish speaker, native speaker from Spanish, and I'm from Mexico. And sometimes I do some translation, but something that I have seen, or something that I encounter pretty often, especially in Spanish, is that because there are different countries, right? They speak Spanish. So that doesn't mean that words are gonna be always the same between all these different countries. So you got on the layer of translating to a different language, then you had to add, or you had to think that some words won't be necessarily universal, even if you're speaking Spanish. So I don't know if you have any advice on that, because usually what I do when I'm doing some of these translations, I go to a couple of people that I know that is from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, person I know from Chile. And then I kind of like run my translation to them, just trying to say like, hey, all of this makes sense for you, because even though we share the language, I know terms doesn't necessarily have to be understood everywhere. I don't know if you have any other advice on that. I don't always do it, of course, because of time. But with things that are more complex, or things that I feel that I might be sounding way too towards the Spanish in Mexico, then I sometimes I jump and do that. But just wondering what you do usually.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And personally, so I don't want to downplay the different colloquial differences between Spanish-speaking countries, because obviously they're significant. But in the case of Spanish, I think of it more as like the difference between British English and the English spoken in Brooklyn or the English spoken in Southern California, where they're mutually intelligible, but there are word choices that, you know, need to be adjusted. So for example, in the UK, a sweater is a jumper, or a lawyer is a barrister, right? So those are things that by and large, any professional translator will be prepared to deal with. Mm-hmm. And mostly we use like a Latin American standard, which I know there is no exact standard, but Latin American Spanish versus Iberian or Peninsular Spanish from Spain, because most of the people in our audience are from the Northern Triangle in Central America and from Mexico, as well as Venezuela and Colombia. And there are some, like I said, people from Puerto Rico and parts of the Caribbean here also. But one of the really good examples of actually needing to use different translators is Arabic, because there are actual root dialects of Arabic that are completely different from one another. I mean, not completely entirely, but for oral interpretation, right? Somebody from Morocco cannot be used to interpret for, you know, somebody who's from Iraq, for example, or Jordanian Arabic is totally different dialect from like, you know, Arabic spoken in, you know, Palestine. And I don't actually know that those pairs are the truth, but I know that written Arabic tends to use modern standard, but spoken, the dialects are so different that you do have to make sure that you're using translators who speak those dialects specifically. So I know I kind of went off on like a long tangent there, but it's to say that I believe that there is a difference between colloquialism and dialect, and where you want to be careful with colloquialisms, that can be handled fairly easily. But when you have dialectal differences, those actually require like specific attention and definitely a second set of eyes to make sure that everything is correct. So I hope that I answered your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Very good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So will you suggest, for instance, something like Arabic, maybe to even consider have two translations made, depending on the region? Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so you're talking about, let's say your organization creates a resource.
Right.
And you want to know which target languages to put it into. Yes, I would say, look at who your audience is. If you do have Arabic speakers from different dialects in your target audience, then yeah, I would just go ahead and have two separate, interpretations. But for written, usually you would just use modern standard.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I have two hands up, and I think Keisha's was up first. So Keisha, do you have a question? Make sure. Oh, she says I didn't. Okay. Sasar, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's actually Louisa. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
But it's fine. We were wondering if you have for helpers a standard that you use to test minimum level skills, or how do you do that? Because for COVID, we had to do that in a pretty emergency response rate. And so then we had people we knew were definitely certified vet the translations to make sure that our helpers were at least a certain level. But I was wondering if there was a testing mechanism that we should potentially utilize for helpers.
Yeah, so there's a pretty well regarded, I think it's Alta Languages is like a company that provides specifically that service, and it's pretty affordable. For emergency situations, you can go about it two ways. You can build your database and vet everybody individually, or you can just have people translate things and then use a third party to proofread the translations or to review the translations. And I think both are valid and good options, but I tend to think of testing people as more of a proactive thing to do, and just having volunteers translate with basic training and then having a third party review them as a more reactive thing, which I think would be more common in emergency situations. And either is fine, but ultimately if you want to build a database of reliable translators who do have verifiable language skills, I would look into either having people you trust and know do the vetting, or using one of these services if you have the budget for it. And I will make a note here to share that link with the group.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
I have a question. I think you mentioned this before, utilizing staff that translates internally. You suggest that they get training?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically anyone who is going to be doing translation or interpretation, just the bare minimum. And you can invest in, people who are on your staff. I think it's worth putting resources into real training, because ultimately having bilingual staff who have it written into their employment contract that they will provide interpretation and translation, giving them the training to do so is long run far better than paying for interpretation services like per diem. right? Or paying for translation services per diem, but just make sure that you're writing it into people's employment contracts, or like doing an addendum for them. Like if you have bilingual staff currently who you think would be worth investing the time into training, like formally. Any other questions today? Okay, well, thank you so much. Apologies that today's lesson needs to be split into two, but I think it's way better to, you know, do it right and take the time to walk through this all. If you want to do a deeper dive, you know, do reach out and schedule one of those sessions, the one-on-one coaching sessions. And otherwise, I will send out an invite in the next couple days for next week's workshop. And I hope to see some of you there. Right.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting now, but feel free to reach out to me individually if you need anything at all.
Okay. Thank you.
Guys, bye.